Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee was 32 years old, in the best physical condition of his life, and 8 days away from finishing his most ambitious film when he lay down with a headache on July 20th, 1973, and never woke up. The official cause of death was cerebral edema, a severe and catastrophic swelling of the brain. But how exactly that swelling was triggered has been debated, studied, and theorized about for over 50 years. What is known is that Lee had complained of a headache that afternoon while meeting with actress Betty Ting Pei at her apartment in Hong Kong. She gave him a tablet of Aquagesic, a painkiller combining meprobamate and aspirin, and he went to lie down in her bedroom. He never regained consciousness. By the time an ambulance reached Queen Elizabeth Hospital, he was already gone. The coroner at the time concluded the most likely cause was an acute hypersensitive reaction to the meprobamate and the Aquagesic, causing fluid retention in the brain. But that explanation never fully satisfied people, partly because of how sudden and complete the collapse was, and partly because Bruce Lee was not someone anyone associated with frailty. In the months before his death, he had actually undergone surgery to have his sweat glands removed, a cosmetic procedure to prevent sweating on camera. And some researchers have pointed to this as a possible factor, since sweating is one of the body's primary mechanisms for regulating heat and fluid. A 2022 study published in the Clinical Kidney Journal proposed what may be the most compelling explanation yet: hyponatremia, or water intoxication, caused by drinking excessive amounts of water and fluid in the weeks leading up to his death. Lee was known to consume enormous quantities of liquid as part of his health regimen, and if his kidneys were unable to excrete the excess, sodium levels in his blood would have dropped dangerously, causing exactly the kind of brain swelling found at autopsy. Whether it was a drug reaction, fluid overload, or something else entirely, no explanation has ever been universally accepted. What has never faded is the eerie parallel to his son Brandon's death 20 years later, which intensified rumors of a family curse that some in Hong Kong took entirely seriously. Bruce Lee transformed martial arts cinema, introduced millions of people in the West to Chinese martial arts culture, and founded Jeet Kune Do, a fighting philosophy that rejected rigid style in favor of adaptability. He died in a quiet apartment bedroom, which remains one of the strangest ironies in the history of combat sports. Masoyama. Masoyama built his reputation on feats so extreme they edge into mythology, and then died of something as ordinary and preventable as lung cancer. Born Choi Young-yui in Korea in 1923, Oyama founded Kyokushin Karate, one of the most physically demanding and full-contact martial arts systems ever developed, and spent decades cementing his legend through acts of extraordinary physical endurance. He reportedly fought and killed 52 bulls barehanded over his career, breaking off their horns with single strikes, though the exact numbers have been disputed, and some accounts are considered exaggerated. He is also said to have completed a 300-man kumite, fighting 300 opponents over 3 consecutive days, a feat that, verified or not, became the defining symbol of Kyokushin's no-excuses culture. Despite all of this, Oyama was a heavy smoker for much of his adult life, and by the early 1990s, his health was deteriorating sharply. He died on April 26, 1994 in Tokyo at the age of 70 from lung cancer. The contrast between his physical mythology and the cause of death is genuinely striking. A man who could shatter horn with his bare hand, brought down not by a worthy opponent but by decades of cigarettes. His death also triggered a significant organizational crisis. Kyokushin had been built entirely around Oyama's personal authority, and without him at the center, the organization fragmented almost immediately. Multiple competing factions emerged, each claiming legitimate succession, and the split has never been fully resolved. Kyokushin remains one of the most respected full-contact karate systems in the world, but the unified organization Oyama spent his life building did not survive him by long. Ed Parker. Ed Parker never got to see how far American Kenpo would eventually reach, because his heart gave out without warning at an airport in the city where his story had started. Born in Hawaii in 1931, Parker brought martial arts into the American mainstream through sheer force of personality, organizational skill, and a willingness to adapt traditional methods to modern realities. He founded American Kenpo Karate and established the Long Beach International Karate Championships in 1964, which became one of the most influential martial arts events in American history. It was there that a 23-year-old Bruce Lee gave an exhibition that caught the attention of Hollywood producer William Dozier and launched his American career. Parker trained celebrities, opened schools across the United States, and became the most recognizable face in American karate for 2 decades. His most famous student was Elvis Presley, whom he trained privately and who held a black belt under Parker's system. By the late 1980s, Parker had been experiencing cardiovascular problems, and on December 15, 1990, while traveling through Honolulu International Airport, he suffered a fatal heart attack. he was 59 years old. The timing felt particularly cruel. He died in his home state, at an airport, in motion, which is a fitting but sad image for someone who spent his entire adult life traveling and promoting. His death left American Kenpo without its central unifying figure, and disputes over lineage, curriculum, and organizational authority fractured the community in the years that followed, a pattern that seems to follow the deaths of foundational martial arts figures with painful regularity. Brandon Lee. Brandon Lee had 8 days left on his filming schedule when a prop gun killed him on a movie set in North Carolina. He was 28 years old. The film was The Crow, a dark gothic action movie set in a rain-soaked nighttime city, and the shoot had been troubled almost from the start. Rush production, budget pressure, and a series of minor accidents that, in retrospect, people would later describe as warning signs. On March 31st, 1993, during a scene in which Brandon's character was shot, a .44 Magnum revolver loaded with a blank cartridge was fired. What no one on set knew was that a fragment of a bullet, a squib, specifically the lead tip from a dummy cartridge used in an earlier scene, had become lodged inside the barrel during a prior setup. When the blank was fired, the pressure behind it propelled the lodged fragment like a real bullet. It struck Brandon in the abdomen, tearing through his body and lodging near his spine. He was rushed to New Hanover Regional Medical Center in Wilmington, where surgeons operated on him for 5 hours. He died early the next morning without regaining consciousness. The accident was ruled exactly that, an accident, and resulted in significant changes to firearms safety protocols on film sets. Protocols that, troublingly, would still prove insufficient enough that a nearly identical failure mode would kill cinematographer Helena Hutchins on the set of Rust in 2021. The Crow was completed using existing footage, body doubles, and early digital face replacement technology, and was released in May 1994 to enormous commercial and critical success. It became one of the most haunting posthumous legacies in film history. The fact that Brandon died exactly 20 years after his father Bruce, both at 32 and 28 respectively, both shockingly young, both at apparent peaks of their careers, created a sense of dynastic tragedy that no rational explanation has ever quite dissolved. Joe Louis. Joe Louis was considered by many, including Bruce Lee himself, to be the greatest American karate fighter who ever lived, and he died from a brain tumor at 68 years old. A brutal irony for a man whose career was built on the precision and power of striking. Louis won his first World Heavyweight Karate Championship in 1967 and dominated full-contact karate and kickboxing competitions through the late 1960s and 1970s, accumulating a level of competitive success that remains essentially unmatched in American martial arts tournament history. His connection to Bruce Lee was direct and personal. Lee served as his private martial arts trainer for a period during the height of both their careers, and Louis credited that influence with transforming his approach to fighting. By the 2000s, Louis had transitioned into teaching, running seminars, and passing on his system to the next generation of practitioners, and by all accounts, he did so with the same intensity he had brought to competition. In 2011, he was diagnosed with glioblastoma multiforme, one of the most aggressive and treatment-resistant forms of brain cancer known to medicine. Average survival following diagnosis is typically measured in months rather than years. Louis died on August 6, 2012, in Cornelius, North Carolina, surviving roughly a year after diagnosis. He continued teaching and appearing at seminars for as long as his health allowed. For someone whose entire identity was built on physical dominance and the ability to impose his will through force, glioblastoma is a particularly merciless way to go, invisible, internal, and utterly indifferent to strength. Antonio Inoki. Antonio Inoki was the man who once lay on his back for 15 rounds and kicked Muhammad Ali's legs into bruised, swollen wreckage, and he died at 79 from a disease most people have never heard of. Born in Japan in 1943, Inoki became one of the most iconic figures in the history of Japanese combat sports, founding New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1972 and turning it into one of the most prestigious fighting organizations in the world. His most famous moment came on June 26, 1976, when he faced Muhammad Ali in a bout billed as a clash between boxing and wrestling. What actually happened was one of the strangest sporting events of the 20th century. Inoki spent the majority of the fight lying on the mat and throwing low kicks at Ali's legs, unable to take him down, but unwilling to stand and be punched. The match was declared a draw, and while it was widely mocked at the time, it is now recognized as a legitimate precursor to the concept of mixed martial arts. The damage to Ali's legs from those kicks was reportedly significant, and some observers have speculated that the repeated trauma contributed to his later health issues, though that connection connection has never been clinically established and remains disputed. In his later years, Inoki became a politician, serving as a member of Japan's House of Councilors, and continued to be a towering public figure in Japanese culture. His final years were spent battling systemic amyloidosis, a rare and serious condition in which misfolded proteins accumulate in organs, including the heart, kidneys, and liver, progressively destroying their ability to function. It is not a fast or merciful disease. Inoki died on October 1st, 2022 in Tokyo at the age of 79. A man who had fought the greatest boxer who ever lived died slowly from protein deposits building up inside his own body. Helio Gracie. Helio Gracie lived to 95, which is remarkable for almost anyone, and almost incomprehensible for someone who competed as a professional fighter, well into his 40s, had his arm broken in a professional bout, and helped create one of the most combat-effective martial arts systems in human history. Born in 1913 in Brazil, Helio developed Gracie Jiu-Jitsu alongside his brother Carlos by adapting Japanese judo to work for smaller, physically weaker practitioners, replacing explosive strength in throws with leverage, timing, and ground control. The principle was simple and radical. A smaller, weaker person should be able to neutralize and defeat a larger, stronger attacker through technique alone. It worked. His most famous fight came on October 23, 1951, when he faced Japanese judo master Masahiko Kimura, widely considered the greatest judoka who had ever lived at that time. Kimura was physically larger and technically dominant, and he eventually locked in the arm lock that now bears his name, an udegarami shoulder lock applied with such force that it broke Helio's arm. Reports differ on whether Helio refused to tap out himself or whether his corner stopped the fight, but either way, he did not submit verbally, and the defeat became one of the most celebrated losses in martial arts history precisely because of the courage it demonstrated. His sons, Royce, Rickson, Royler, Rorian, and others, carried Gracie Jiu-Jitsu across the world, with Royce winning the first, second, and fourth UFC tournaments in the early 1990s and introducing the world to what submission grappling could do against strikers and wrestlers. Helio died on January 29, 2009, at his home in Petrópolis, Brazil, at 95 years old, of natural causes. He outlived nearly every fighter of his generation by decades. For a man who spent his life proving that physical disadvantage could be overcome, dying peacefully at 95 is perhaps the most fitting possible ending. Gichin Funakoshi. Gichin Funakoshi looked like a retired school teacher, and in a sense that is exactly what he was, except that the subject he spent his life teaching rewired the martial culture of an entire country. Born in Okinawa in 1868, Funakoshi is widely credited as the father of modern karate, the man who transformed a regional Okinawan fighting art into a nationally practiced discipline and eventually a global phenomenon. The pivotal moment came in 1922 when he was invited to demonstrate karate at a physical education exhibition in Tokyo, organized by the Ministry of Education. The demonstration was received so well that he stayed in Japan rather than returning to Okinawa, spending the rest of his life spreading karate across the mainland. He founded the Shotokan style, named after his pen name Shoto, and emphasized that karate was fundamentally a discipline of character and self-development, rather than a fighting system. His famous 20 precepts, published in 1938, begin with the line that karate begins and ends with courtesy, a philosophy that shaped how the art was taught and understood for generations. One of the quiet tragedies of his later life was that his son Yoshitaka, who had been instrumental in developing the more dynamic and athletic elements of Shotokan karate, died in 1945, 12 years before his father. Funakoshi outlived the son he had trained and collaborated with, and continued his work alone into his late 80s. He died on April 26, 1957, in Tokyo at the age of 88 of natural causes. He never held a formal black belt rank. He considered the ranking system irrelevant to the deeper purpose of martial training, and died having seen karate take root across Japan, though not yet having seen what it would become globally. Few founders of anything have had such a long, clear view of their own legacy. Jean Lebel. Jean Lebel was the kind of person who made every room he walked into immediately more interesting, usually because he was wearing a bright pink G, and he was also almost certainly the most dangerous person in that room, regardless of who else was in it. Born in Los Angeles in 1932, Lebel won the AAU National Judo Championship in both 1954 and 1955, and spent the following decades as a professional wrestler, stunt coordinator, and martial arts instructor to what amounted to a who's who of combat sports in Hollywood. He trained Ronda Rousey, worked with Chuck Norris, and was a significant influence on early mixed martial arts in the United States. One of his most important moments came in 1963, when he fought professional boxer Milo Savage in what is considered one of the earliest earliest documented mixed rules fights. LeBell choked Savage unconscious in the 4th round, years before the concept of cross-discipline competition had any kind of organized framework. There is also a famous and vigorously disputed story involving Steven Seagal on a film set, in which LeBell allegedly choked the action star unconscious after Seagal claimed that grapplers could not submit a resisting striker. Seagal has denied this happened. LeBell neither confirmed nor denied it with any particular urgency, which told its own story. He was known throughout his career for a cheerful, self-deprecating humor that belied the fact that he had spent 60 years being genuinely terrifying in training rooms. He died on August 9, 2022, in Los Angeles at the age of 89 of natural causes. He was active in the martial arts community essentially until the end, which is perhaps the most Gene LeBell way to go. Kimbo Slice. Kimbo Slice looked physically indestructible. 6 feet tall, nearly 100 kilograms of muscle, a beard like armor plating, and a jaw that had absorbed full power punches from professional fighters without going down. And then he died at 42 from heart failure, killed by the one organ no opponent had ever been able to reach. Born Kevin Ferguson in the Bahamas in 1974, Kimbo grew up in Miami and became one of the first internet-famous fighters, long before that was a recognized category of celebrity. Grainy videos of him dominating backyard brawls spread across early YouTube and fight forums in the mid-2000s, and he became a genuine viral phenomenon at a time when the internet was still figuring out what viral meant. The street fighting was real, his power was real, his toughness was real, and it attracted legitimate MMA promotion interest. He signed with Elite XC, headline network television cards, and drew ratings that the sport had rarely seen outside of UFC pay-per-view events. His ground game was always the exploitable weakness, and when he eventually lost, it was usually by submission or ground and pound from opponents who could take him down and work from there. He later competed in the UFC briefly and then in Bellator, fighting his last professional bout in early 2016. In May of that year, he was hospitalized with what was described as heart failure, and his name was placed on a transplant waiting list as his condition rapidly worsened. He died on June 6, 2016 in Coral Springs, Florida. He was 42 years old. His death hit the MMA community hard precisely because nothing about his appearance suggested vulnerability. He was the embodiment of physical intimidation, and yet the thing that killed him was a silent deterioration happening in his chest, while everyone was watching his fists. Roxon Gracie. Roxon Gracie never got the chance to show the world what he could do, and that is what makes his story the most painful entry on this list. The son of Rickson Gracie, widely regarded among practitioners as the greatest Brazilian jiu-jitsu fighter who has ever lived, Roxon was described by those who trained with him as possessing abilities that exceeded even the most celebrated members of the Gracie family. That is a staggering claim given the lineage. People who sparred with him said his instincts and timing were on a level that no one in the family had seen before, and the expectation was that he would eventually surpass his father and carry the Gracie name into a new era. Instead, Roxon died of a drug overdose in New York City in 2000 at 19 years old. He had been living in the city and had reportedly been struggling with substance issues in the period before his death. Rickson, who had fought some of the most dangerous men in the world and never been submitted in competition, has spoken openly in interviews about how completely his son's death undid him. He described it as the worst thing that had ever happened to him by an enormous margin. Worse than any defeat, worse than any injury, worse than anything combat had ever produced. Rickson withdrew from competition after Roxon's death, and while he cited various reasons over the years, no one who listened to him speak about his son doubted what the real reason was. The most gifted heir to the most famous martial arts dynasty in history died at 19, and his father never quite came back from it. Choi Hong-hee. Choi Hong-hee founded Taekwondo, spent decades fighting to spread it across the world, watched it become an Olympic sport, and then died in the capital city of North Korea, which, for a South Korean general and nationalist, is about as geopolitically strange as a death can get. Born in 1918 in what is now North Korea, Choi served as a general in the South Korean army, and developed Taekwondo in the 1950s and 1960s as a codified Korean martial art distinct from Japanese karate, which it had previously resembled closely. The politics surrounding his art were always complicated. When the South Korean government moved to consolidate control over Taekwondo's international development, Choi clashed bitterly with the establishment and eventually left South Korea, relocating first to Canada and later establishing his International Taekwondo Federation in Vienna. The final rupture came when he chose to introduce Taekwondo to North Korea in the 1980s, a decision that permanently ended any possibility of reconciliation with the South Korean authorities. This also contributed directly to to the split between his ITF organization and what is now World Taekwondo, the body that governs Olympic Taekwondo, a division that persists to this day. In his final years, Choi had been diagnosed with lymphoma, and as his health deteriorated, he traveled to Pyongyang, where North Korean authorities had welcomed him and his art. He died there on June 15, 2002, at the age of 83. North Korea gave him a state funeral, which means the man who created South Korea's national martial art was mourned officially and publicly by South Korea's greatest adversary, while his homeland barely acknowledged his passing. Whatever he believed in politically, the strangeness of that ending is hard to overstate. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.